Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 4 about the legislative branch, and it's Lesson 15 concerning racial gerrymandering. In this lesson, you'll learn what racial gerrymandering is, and you'll learn about benign racial gerrymandering. You'll learn about majority-minority districts, about the packing of Democrats in those districts, and how they encourage extremism. After the Civil War, racial gerrymandering, in other words, remember what gerrymandering is from the previous lesson. It's the drawing of boundaries in congressional districts to help or hurt some group. Well, after the Civil War, gerrymandering was done with race in mind. It wasn't just packing and cracking Democrats or Republicans. It was cracking or packing people based upon their race. So creating district boundaries based on the racial composition of communities. And that was done, it was used to reduce the influence of black voters. Now this was accomplished by black neighborhoods being cracked. So divided up, a little bit of each neighborhood put in a district then that was predominantly white. And this was done by the white legislature that controlled the redistricting. So by putting a few of the black voters in a district with lots of white voters and a few other of the black voters in a district with lots of white voters, etc., there was never enough black voters altogether to actually elect a black member of Congress. Instead, everybody from every district would be white. At least that was the idea that the state legislatures had at the time in order to stop black voters from being represented in Congress. This process came to an end in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended negative racial gerrymandering in the country. Now what I mean by this is it ended the use of racial gerrymandering to harm minority groups. Racial gerrymandering still exists for some other reasons that I'll talk about in a moment. But the kind of cracking of minority neighborhoods that I described a moment ago to make sure that minority voters were distributed into other districts where whites were the majority, thus preventing minorities from ever electing a minority candidate, does not happen anymore. If a state tried to do that, they would get sued, the courts would intervene, and a stop would be put to it. The racial gerrymandering that's done today still is done for reasons that are described as benign. I have that in quotation marks because that's the term actually used by legislators and by the courts as they do this. Now what benign means is that something isn't harmful. You may have heard this term used when somebody's talked about a cancer scare, for example. They can say, oh, I had a tumor, but I had it checked and it was benign. In other words, it wasn't cancerous, it wasn't harmful. So that's what people are trying to convey when they call modern racial gerrymandering benign. They're trying to say that it isn't designed to hurt minority voters, but rather help them. This is done by minority neighborhoods being packed together. Rather than being split apart, instead they are grouped and concentrated so that it's assumed the minority voters then will vote for minority candidates who will then become minority representatives in Congress. In this way, the hope is that minority voters will be represented by people who are like them, who physically represent them by appearing the same. Benign racial gerrymandering creates what are known as majority-minority districts. In other words, in the districts that have been gerrymandered for racial reasons, majority of the voters in those districts are of minority races. So a majority-minority district will be predominantly black or predominantly Hispanic, for example, also. There are a number of districts in places such as Texas that have been gerrymandered with Hispanics in mind instead of African Americans. An example of a racially gerrymandered district is the North Carolina 12th district, which we saw in the previous lesson. This North Carolina 12th district has remained pretty much intact for quite some time, regardless of who was controlling the state legislature in North Carolina. Prior to the 2010 census, allowing for a new redistricting of North Carolina, the boundaries looked as they appear in the top map. This had been designed by a democratically controlled legislature. Now notice you can still identify that 12th district on the map. It's that long, thin one that you see, sort of in the middle of the state. Well, after the 2010 census, with Republicans now in charge of the state legislature, when they finally had a chance to redraw the map in 2012, they redrew the boundaries so that now more seats in the Congress would be won, more seats in the House of Representatives would be won by Republicans, as reflected in the colors changing on the map. But you can see that the 12th district is still there. It's still blue, still being won by Democrats, because it's still packed with minority voters. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. The minority voters that pack it are predominantly black. The thing to notice here is that both political parties had hands in drawing this district. Prior to 2010, it was drawn by Democrats. After 2010, it was drawn by Republicans, but they both kept it intact. Now, why would that be, that both political parties would want to engage in this kind of benign racial gerrymandering? Well, the answer is seen in the voting that members of minority groups predominantly do. They almost, well, I shouldn't say almost always, they, by a clear majority, support the Democratic Party. Blacks are the most supportive. In the 2012 election, 93% of them voted Democrat. But both Hispanic and Asians are over 70% in their support for the Democratic Party. Now, what this means is that when a legislature creates a majority-minority district to produce minority representatives in Congress, they're effectively producing people who will vote Democratic when they get elected. Because when you lump all the minorities in that district, you're also effectively lumping Democrats in. But when you pack the Democrats into that district so that then the minorities in it can vote for and elect a minority candidate, you also are effectively increasing Republican representation in the other districts around that majority-minority district. So this is the reason then that both Democrats and Republicans like creating these districts. Democrats are overwhelmingly supported by minority voters. And so they want to kind of reward these minority voters by creating districts where they can vote for someone who descriptively is like them, sometimes called descriptive representation. Their goal is that black voters will be able to elect black candidates. Hispanic voters will be able to elect Hispanic candidates. Now, I'm just describing the reality of the situation. I'm not saying whether it's bad or good, because I know that some people are offended by this, offended by the idea that the political parties would assume that somebody's going to vote a certain way or for a certain candidate just because of the color of their skin, assuming that black voters will vote for the black candidate, for example. Some people find that insulting. Not all people, but some people do. But whether you find it insulting or not, that is the actual goal that's trying to be accomplished here when Democrats create these majority-minority districts. Now, Republicans also like to create them, but for a different reason. When they create them, they realize that when they pack those minority voters in and allow them to then elect someone to Congress, they're effectively packing Democrats in also, which makes the other districts in the state more Republican, more likely to elect Republicans to Congress. So both political parties have reason to do this, and they both engage in it. But there's a potentially negative result. The creating of majority-minority district produces not just Democrats in Congress, but more extreme Democrats. Because when someone is representing a district that's made up almost entirely of Democrats, to get elected from that district, they have to prove that they're the most democratically leaning Democrat. They have to be even more so Democrat, which oftentimes means liberal. This then has an effect on the more Republican districts around them also, because they are more Republican. The people getting elected from there have to be more Republican in the way they appeal to voters, which makes them more extreme also. So the creation of these majority-minority districts is making everybody in Congress more extreme. When you make them more extreme, they're less likely to get along with each other and get things done. An illustration of the effect of this is this set of pictures here on this slide. The most liberal members of Congress are dominated by people from racial minority groups who are elected from majority-minority districts. On the slide of 8 of the most liberal members of the House of Representatives, we've got 6 African Americans, 1 Hispanic American, and 1 Asian American. And this is the result you get when you create these majority-minority districts. Yes, you do get people from minority groups elected to Congress, but they tend to be extremely democratic, extremely liberal. And on the other side, the people in the districts around them tend to be more extremely conservative, more extremely Republican. And as I said, it makes it more difficult for the members of Congress to get along and get things done. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. How has racial gerrymandering been used to harm black voters? Did it stop them from voting? Did it pack their communities in the sense of packing and cracking? Did it help Hispanics instead of blacks? Or did it crack the black communities? Racial gerrymandering was used to harm black voters initially by cracking their communities. In other words, splitting up their communities so only a few black voters would be in each of the districts, and there'd never be enough black voters together in one place to actually elect a black candidate. How has racial gerrymandering been used to help black voters? Has it been used to allow more voting days? Has it been used to pack their communities? Has it been used to limit white voting? Or has it been used to crack their communities? Racial gerrymandering has been used to help black voters by packing their communities. The idea is by packing a bunch of black voters together, they then can elect representatives who they feel are like them. What is a majority-minority district? Is it a place that usually votes for the losing party? Is it a collection of voters that are a mix of races? Is it an undersized district? Or is it mostly made up of voters of a minority race? A majority-minority district is composed mostly of voters of a minority race. What is a side effect of benign racial gerrymandering? Is it the packing of Democrats? The packing of Republicans? Fewer minorities getting elected? Or more moderate parties? Benign racial gerrymandering results in the packing of Democrats. It actually results in more minority candidates being elected, but it also causes the parties to be less moderate. That completes this lesson, and it completes Unit 4. The next lesson will be from Unit 5, Lesson 1, and it will be about powers assigned to the President of the United States.